The first thing you need to know is this. In the heart of Louisville, Kentucky, there stands a building so massive it looks less like a hospital and more like a fortress. The Waverly Hills Sanatorium opened its doors in 1910, expanded to its hulking 5-story structure by 1926, and for decades it became a last stop for thousands of men, women, and children stricken with tuberculosis. Doctors wrote that many who walked through its doors never walked out again. But here's where the story twists. If you believe the popular legends, as many as 63,000 souls died inside those walls. That number alone would make Waverly Hills one of the deadliest hospitals in American history. Yet historians and surviving staff insist the number is wildly inflated, some saying the true toll was far, far lower. The truth seems buried between dusty ledgers and whispered stories. So what's real? Were there thousands upon thousands of deaths, their bodies wheeled silently down the infamous body chute tunnel under cover of night? Or is that number part of a legend, fed by shadows, creaking doors, and the thrill of ghost hunters who swear the building itself is alive with echoes? Quick pause. Where are you watching from, and what time is it right now? Comment below. It's always wild to see these sleepless stories circle the globe. Step closer with me, just past midnight. Imagine the building, looming brick walls, long corridors lined with broken windows, the faint scent of mildew clinging to the air. The silence isn't really silence. It's broken by the occasional groan of wood, a whisper of wind through the solarium, and if you listen carefully, what some visitors swear are voices calling faintly from rooms that should be empty. When the sanatorium opened, it was meant as a beacon of hope, a place to fight the white plague, with fresh air, sunlight, and the latest medical methods. But quickly its reputation shifted. For many, Waverly Hills was not a place of recovery, but a place where people went to die. And when the numbers grew, whispers began to rise, stories that the hospital was covering up the scale of its losses, quietly lowering body after body down that shadowed tunnel to the waiting hearses below. The building itself hasn't helped its own reputation. Tourists today describe it as if it drinks in the fear of those who visit. They speak of shadows moving across the halls, cold spots that grip your bones, and the unmistakable feeling of being watched, even when the room is empty. Paranormal investigators, some seasoned, some skeptics, have walked out shaken, swearing they left with voices still echoing in their ears. But the question remains, are these experiences the restless cries of thousands of lost souls, or the echoes of exaggeration layered over real history? Because here's the first mystery. In the records we can trace, the worst year of death at Waverly saw around 150 patients perish. Horrific enough, but nowhere near 63,000. Yet the legend refuses to die. Tour guides, ghost hunters, and visitors all repeat the number, building its myth until it has become gospel in the paranormal world. And just maybe, the walls of Waverly prefer it that way. He opened the door to the nursery, and what he saw ended his career forever. But before I tell you, I want to know, have you ever been so scared you quit your job on the spot? Drop your story in the comments below. To understand Waverly Hills, you have to picture America in the early 1900s. Tuberculosis, the white plague, was everywhere. It didn't matter if you were rich or poor. This disease crept into lungs and spread silently through families, towns, and whole cities. By the time Waverly Hills was first planned, 1 in every 7 deaths worldwide was caused by TB. Families lived in constant dread of the cough that never went away. Doctors in those years didn't have antibiotics. The so-called cure was a mixture of fresh air, sunlight, and rest, what they called sanatorium treatment. And so, across the country, sanatoriums began to rise, almost like fortresses against the plague. In Louisville, the local board of tuberculosis hospital bought land on a hill, hoping that the clean breezes drifting above the city could heal the sick. In 1910, the first Waverly Hills Hospital opened, a modest 2-story wooden structure meant for about 40 patients. It didn't take long before the beds overflowed. Tuberculosis was relentless, and soon the hospital had to expand. By 1926, the towering 5-story concrete structure was complete. With room for over 400 patients, it became one of the largest sanatoriums in the United States. The building itself was designed with the disease in mind. Its long wings stretched out to catch as much sunlight as possible. Balconies and solariums were lined with rows of beds, so patients could lie outside even in the dead of winter, bundled in blankets while the cold air filled their lungs. The philosophy was simple: sunshine kills the bacteria, and fresh air gives the body a chance to fight. But as hopeful as that sounded, reality was cruel. For many patients, Waverly Hills was the last place they would ever see. Imagine walking into that grand building, the echoes of footsteps bouncing off its tiled halls, knowing that you might never walk back out. Families brought their loved ones here with tears and hope, but often, all they got in return was silence. Even so, life inside wasn't entirely grim. Nurses and doctors tried to create a sense of community. There were holiday celebrations, games for children, even small concerts to lift spirits. Photographs from the time show patients smiling on the balconies, bundled in coats, sunlight pouring over them. But behind those smiles, the shadow of death was always close. The hospital was isolated by design. Patients weren't allowed to leave, and visitors were limited. It wasn't just a medical center, it was a world of its own. Once you entered, your life revolved around the disease, the treatments, and the ever-present question: would you survive, or would you be carried down that tunnel beneath the building? And it was in this environment, hope on one hand, despair on the other, that the stories of haunting first began to take root. Because when thousands of people share the same space of fear, pain, and dying, it leaves behind an atmosphere. Some say it lingers in the bricks, the floorboards, even in the silence of those empty halls. As the decades rolled on, tuberculosis never let up. The wards filled to capacity, then overflowed. Doctors worked tirelessly, experimenting with risky procedures, collapsing a lung to give it rest, removing ribs to let the infected lung expand, even surgical techniques that now sound brutal. Many patients endured these operations, some survived, but countless others didn't. All of it added to the reputation of Waverly Hills as more than just a hospital. It became a place where death was routine, where grief was a daily companion, and where the walls themselves seemed to collect sorrow like dust. And still, beyond the cold statistics, the building remained strangely beautiful. Visitors describe its arched windows, its long symmetrical corridors, the sense that it was built as both sanctuary and fortress. But when the sun went down and the wards grew quiet, nurses swore they felt something watching them. Some said they heard footsteps where no one walked, doors closing softly down the hall. These were the earliest whispers of something that went beyond medicine. The story of Waverly Hills isn't just about tuberculosis. It's about the atmosphere that was born inside its walls, a tension between life and death that still breathes there a century later. And that tension would only grow stronger. Because soon, the sanatorium would earn a darker reputation, not just as a hospital of hope, but as a place where despair sometimes drove people to desperate ends. By the 1930s, Waverly Hills was no longer just a hospital. It was a city of the dying. The long halls echoed with the sound of coughs, wheezing breaths, and the faint shuffle of nurses moving from bed to bed. Every day, more patients arrived at the gates, and every day, more families left without their loved ones. Tuberculosis had no mercy. For some, the treatments worked. Rest, sunlight, and fresh air gave them enough strength to fight off the infection. But for others, the disease lingered like a shadow, draining their bodies little by little until the end came quietly. Patients would smile one day, trying to play a game of cards or write a letter home, and by the next morning, their bed would be empty. The doctors and nurses tried to shield patients from the constant presence of death. They knew the toll it took when someone died in the next bed over. So Waverly Hills developed a system, one that later became the source of its darkest legend. Beneath the building stretched a long concrete passageway, sloping down into the woods. Officially, it was called the service tunnel. Staff used it to bring in supplies, coal, and food during the winter months. But its other purpose was darker. When a patient died, orderlies would quietly wheel the body onto a stretcher, cover it with a sheet, and roll it down into the tunnel. From there, the dead could be discreetly loaded into waiting hearses out of sight. They called it the body chute. For the staff, it was practical. It spared the living patients from watching a steady stream of corpses leave through the main hallways. But for those who heard about it later, the tunnel became a symbol of Waverly's reputation as a place of endless death. Imagine standing at the mouth of that tunnel at night. The air inside is heavy, cold, and damp. Your footsteps echo, bouncing back at you from the walls. Halfway down, the darkness is absolute, so black it feels like it swallows your breath. Investigators who've walked it swear they hear whispers and shuffling footsteps that aren't their own. Some claim they felt a cold hand brush their arm as if one of the countless spirits still lingers, waiting for release. During its peak years, Waverly Hills saw as many as 100 patients die in a single year. Records suggest the highest annual toll was around 150, already staggering, but far from the 60 or 70,000 often claimed in ghost tours. Still, when you add the decades together, the sanatorium witnessed thousands of deaths. Enough, perhaps, to leave an indelible mark. Death was not just an ending here, it was routine. Staff learned to move quickly, quietly, respectfully. But patients noticed the rhythm. Beds emptied, then filled again. The sounds of grief, quiet sobs in the night, became part of the building's atmosphere. And in that repetition, in that endless cycle of dying and waiting, legends began to take shape. Some patients whispered that the hospital itself was cursed. Others believed the spirits of the dead still roamed the halls, unwilling to let go. Even doctors admitted they sometimes felt uneasy in the wards after dark. One nurse would later recall walking past an empty room and hearing a woman softly singing, though no patient had been assigned there in years. For the patients who remained, the fear of the tunnel was constant. Some swore they could hear the stretchers rolling late at night, the sound echoing up from below. For them, the body chute was not just a passageway. It was the final destination they hoped never to reach. The atmosphere of despair, the relentless pace of death, and the unspoken knowledge of what lay beneath the hospital all combined to create something chilling. The building wasn't just housing patients, it was absorbing their fear, their pain, their last breaths. And that's why even today, people claim the walls still remember. The echoes of footsteps, the whispers in the dark, the shadows darting at the edge of your vision, some say they are not tricks of the mind. They are the aftershocks of the thousands who passed through Waverly Hills, still replaying their final moments over and over again. But as grim as this daily rhythm was, Waverly's story only grows darker when you look at the individuals, the staff and patients whose personal tragedies carved legends into the building itself. And one room, more than any other, became the heart of that darkness. Behind the statistics and the hospital walls, Waverly Hills was kept alive by its staff. Doctors, nurses, and orderlies worked long, grueling hours, often with little hope of saving their patients. They fought the White Plague, with every tool they had, but they also carried the weight of endless loss. For the nurses especially, the work was both intimate and crushing. They were the ones who sat beside coughing children, who read letters from family members to dying men too weak to hold the paper. They organized dances and holiday decorations to keep spirits alive. And yet, after hours, when the halls fell silent, they were the ones left with the shadows. It's no wonder that so many of Waverly's ghost stories focus not on the patients, but on the nurses themselves. And no room carries a darker legend than Room 502. Room 502 was located on the hospital's top floor, and according to legend, it became the stage for one of Waverly's most enduring tragedies. The story goes like this. Sometime in the 1920s, a young nurse working in the women's ward found herself pregnant, scandalous in that era, especially since she was unmarried. Overwhelmed by shame, fear, and the relentless atmosphere of death around her, she allegedly hanged herself from a light fixture in room 502. That's one version. Another says she may have been forced, or that despair drove her to climb out the window, ending her life with a fall to the ground below. Still others whisper that she was not alone when she died, that something darker lured her into that room and never let her leave. What's certain is this: decades later, countless visitors and investigators have reported strange experiences in room 502. Some describe a heavy, suffocating sadness the moment they step inside. Others claim to see a woman in white, silently standing by the window before vanishing. Paranormal teams have captured voices on recorders, faint whispers of a woman saying, "Help me!" Even skeptics admit the room feels different. Cold drafts swirl in circles, shadows flicker where no light should cast them, and some guests leave abruptly, saying the room made them physically sick. Guides tell of visitors who burst into tears without knowing why, overwhelmed by grief that doesn't belong to them. The legend of Room 502 is more than a ghost story. It's a reflection of the pressure, despair, and loneliness that weighed heavily on the people who worked inside Waverly Hills. Nurses weren't immune to the hospital's darkness. They saw hundreds die, comforted the sick until their own spirits broke, and sometimes, they became the building's next story. Other accounts echo this theme. Staff reported strange happenings long before the sanatorium closed. A doctor once insisted he saw a man in a long coat walking down the hallway, only for the figure to fade into nothing. Orderlies whispered about footsteps echoing in the wards at night when no patients were assigned there. These weren't just frightened patients imagining things. These were professionals, trained to deal with suffering, and yet they were shaken by what they saw. Room 502, though, remains the epicenter. Paranormal investigators call it one of the most active rooms in the building. Some say the nurse still lingers there, replaying her final moments. Others believe the room has become a kind of trap, where the weight of despair clings to anyone who enters. And as unsettling as these stories are, they are only the beginning. Because while Room 502 gave the hospital one of its most infamous legends, the building as a whole was about to step fully into folklore. Over the years, the stories of death and sorrow would grow louder, the numbers would swell beyond fact, and Waverly Hills would transform from a place of medicine into a monument of the paranormal. By the mid-20th century, Waverly Hills was already a building heavy with memory. Thousands had passed through its doors, and for many, it had been their final stop. But once the hospital closed its wards to tuberculosis in 1961, something interesting began to happen. The facts started to blur. Historians who comb through Jefferson County's death records estimate that during the sanatorium's busiest years, the number of deaths might have reached several hundred annually. Over the span of decades, that adds up to a tragic but realistic total of 5,000 to 8,000. Painful, yes, but a far cry from the 63,000 that has become the most quoted figure. So how did the number swell into legend? Part of it came from oral history. Former patients and staff told their stories, but as they passed from neighbor to neighbor, the details grew larger than life. Local kids dared each other to sneak inside the abandoned building, and in the dark, every shadow seemed like proof of the tales they'd already heard. Newspapers reported ghost sightings, TV specials latched onto America's Most Haunted Hospital, and suddenly the number 63,000 was repeated so often that people stopped questioning it. And then there was the body chute. The body chute wasn't designed to be terrifying. Officially called the Death Tunnel, it was a long, concrete passage that ran down the hillside, connecting the hospital to the railway tracks below. It was practical, an easy way to bring in supplies and, yes, to discreetly remove bodies. During the height of the tuberculosis epidemic, when death was constant, patients and staff were already demoralized. Doctors wanted a way to keep the sight of hearse after hearse from breaking morale. So the bodies of the dead were lowered down that tunnel in secret, placed onto carts, and rolled out to the waiting hearses unseen. In the harsh light of medical necessity, it was a simple solution. But in the flicker of a flashlight decades later, the tunnel became something else entirely. A nightmare. Explorers describe it as a place where the air feels heavier than anywhere else on the property. The concrete walls seem to close in, the sound of footsteps echo unnaturally, and shadows creep at the edge of vision. Paranormal investigators have recorded strange bangs, whispers, and even the sensation of being grabbed in the tunnel. It's not just a passage anymore, it's a graveyard of stories, feeding the legend of Waverly Hills. By the 1970s and 80s, the building's reputation had shifted from medical history to folklore. Locals told of lights flickering in windows when the electricity was long gone, of screams carried on the wind, of children's laughter in the solarium. Waverly Hills had become more than a place. It was a character in its own right, a looming figure in Kentucky's haunted landscape. And once ghost hunters arrived with cameras, recorders, and night vision lenses, the legend only deepened. Every EVP, every photograph of a shadowy figure, every unexplained cold spot added fuel to the fire. The hospital was no longer just a place where people had died. It was becoming a place where people believed death still lingered. But the legend didn't stop there. Waverly Hills would soon face decades of neglect, vandalism, and bizarre redevelopment schemes, and those chapters would make the building even stranger. Because when a group tried to turn it into a prison, something happened that still gives investigators chills. Before I tell you what, I want to hear from you. What creeps you out more, the idea of thousands of real deaths, or the possibility that just one restless spirit can haunt a place forever? Drop your take in the comments below. After Waverly Hills closed its doors to tuberculosis patients in 1961, the building's story didn't end, it simply changed shape. For years, the massive structure sat mostly empty, a hulking silhouette against the Kentucky sky. The once pristine corridors grew cold and damp, the sunlight from the solariums now barely cutting through layers of dust. In the 1960s and 70s, the state briefly used parts of the hospital for other medical purposes, but the majority of the facility sat abandoned. Broken windows, peeling paint, and rusting stairwells turned the sanatorium into a ghost in the literal sense. The bodies of history remained, though the bodies themselves were long gone. It was during this period that rumors of hauntings began to take on a life of their own. Local teenagers dared each other to sneak into the empty halls. Paranormal curiosity mixed with teenage bravado, and soon the stories spread, shadowy figures in the corridors, whispering voices in the solarium, the cold touch of an unseen hand. Each retelling made the building larger in the imagination, more ominous, more alive with the presence of the dead. In the 1980s, an ambitious, but ill-fated, plan was proposed. The state considered converting Waverly Hills into a prison. Architects walked the halls, imagining cells where patient rooms had been, trying to retrofit a building of light and air into one of control and confinement. But contractors quickly ran into problems. Structural issues, asbestos, crumbling floors, all real obstacles, yet whispers persist that workers reported strange events, tools disappearing, footsteps echoing in empty halls, doors slamming with no wind. The plan was abandoned. Abandonment fed the legend. Vandals broke in, leaving graffiti on walls once lined with patient charts. Urban explorers documented the decay, posting grainy photos online that only heightened the building's eerie reputation. Every cracked tile, every broken window, every hallway stripped of electricity became a stage for imagination. The infamous body chute tunnel, once a practical necessity, gained a reputation as a dark artery of the building's ghostly activity. Visitors reported chills as they walked its length, shadows darting along its concrete walls, whispers floating from nowhere. Even skeptics admitted the tunnel carried a peculiar sense of dread. It was in these decades, during neglect and decay, that Waverly Hills evolved from a tragic hospital into a paranormal icon. The building itself became a magnet, not for patients, but for curiosity, for fear, and for those who chased the unknown. And yet, amid the rumors and stories, some of the most compelling encounters came from people who simply stayed the night. Ghost hunting teams, documentary crews, and even casual tourists began describing experiences that defied easy explanation. Cold spots so severe it felt like ice gripping their bones. Footsteps that echoed in perfect cadence with no living source. Objects moving, sometimes violently, with no one around to touch them. Some visitors claimed to have captured voices, low, moaning, desperate. Others swear they glimpsed figures in the windows, only for the empty halls to confirm there was no one there. All of this, combined with the building's decaying grandeur, turned Waverly Hills into something more than a hospital or historical site. It became a character of the night itself. By the 1990s and early 2000s, private ownership took over. Restoration began in patches. Tours opened, both historical and paranormal. Visitors now could walk the same halls where thousands once suffered, with flashlights tracing the same shadows that had given rise to decades of legends. But even with electricity and security, the stories persisted. Guests reported footsteps following them, voices calling their names, doors that opened and closed of their own accord. And the most chilling reports always came from the same places: Room 502, the solarium, and of course, the tunnel beneath the building. It's easy to write all this off as imagination. Easy to blame shadows, drafts, or fear. But ask anyone who's spent the night here quietly, and they'll tell you it's different. The air itself seems charged, heavy with memory. The silence carries a voice. And even if you've never believed in ghosts before, Waverly Hills has a way of convincing you to wonder. And tonight, as the wind rattles against the broken windows, one question lingers. The last night shift nurse left the third-floor ward at midnight. She swore she heard soft singing coming from room 502, though it had been empty for decades. When she peeked in, nothing was there, but the lullaby continued, drifting down the hall, fading slowly, almost teasing her. And that's where we leave the building for now, on the edge of sound, shadow, and memory, waiting for those brave, or foolish, enough to explore its depths. By the early 2000s, Waverly Hills had fully stepped out of history and into legend. Private ownership restored parts of the sprawling complex, opening it to the public for tours, both historical and paranormal. Visitors arrived with flashlights in hand, cameras, and notebooks, hoping to witness what so many had whispered about for decades. Ghost hunters were drawn like moths to a flame. Teams from across the country, and even overseas, began filming, recording, and investigating every corner of the sanatorium. From room 502 to the solarium, from the east wing to the infamous body chute, they documented every chill, every shadow, every unexplained sound. Some captured low rumbles in empty halls. Others recorded faint whispers on digital recorders, words that seemed to echo the pain and despair of decades past. Tour guides quickly learned that the building had a personality of its own. Many described the sensation of being watched, the air thickening without explanation, and cold spots so intense they felt like ice gripping the bones. One guide swore that when the sun set, the hallway outside room 502 would darken even if the lights were on, a shadow that didn't belong to any person or object. Visitors weren't immune either. Guests walking through the solarium reported seeing fleeting shapes in the corners of their vision. Cameras often caught blurry figures that weren't there when the footage was reviewed. And in the tunnels, where the deceased were once wheeled out, people described a heaviness, a weight pressing down, as though the memories of the countless dead still lingered in the concrete walls. Despite the skepticism, these experiences created a cycle. The more people visited, the more stories emerged. The more stories circulated online, the more visitors came. Paranormal television shows added fuel to the fire, broadcasting the sanatorium's haunted reputation to millions. Every EV piece, every photo of a shadow, every anecdote became part of the Waverly Hills mythos. Yet the investigators often acknowledged a strange duality. Many admitted that while some phenomena could be explained by old buildings, drafts, or creaking wood, there were moments that defied logic. Footsteps that perfectly mirrored their own, whispers in empty rooms, the sensation of breath on the back of their necks when no one was near. Even the skeptics had moments they couldn't rationalize. And tourists weren't just passive observers. Overnight stays became popular, marketed as immersive experiences for thrill-seekers. Participants reported vivid dreams, objects moving in their rooms, and footsteps pacing the hallways above them. Some returned with bruises they couldn't explain, photos of unexplained orbs, and the lingering feeling that something unseen had shared their room. Social media amplified the legend further. YouTube channels, blogs, and online forums shared videos, pictures, and testimonies, giving Waverly Hills a global reputation. People from around the world booked tours, driven by curiosity, skepticism, or a simple desire to experience the fear themselves. Even historians who tried to separate fact from fiction admitted that the modern experiences couldn't be entirely dismissed. Many argued that the building's history, the atmosphere of death and despair, and the sheer weight of decades of human suffering created an environment primed for paranormal experiences. The modern investigation era turned Waverly Hills into a living legend, a place where history and myth intertwined so tightly that separating them became nearly impossible. Every tour, every overnight stay, every camera flash seemed to reinforce the idea that the building remembered its past. And yet, amid the thrill-seekers and paranormal investigators, some of the most unsettling stories were the quiet ones, encounters that didn't make the camera. Shadows moving at the edge of vision, whispers that spoke only to the heart, cold spots that lingered long after a room was vacated. These were the moments that reminded everyone that Waverly Hills wasn't just a relic of the past. It was alive in a way that modern visitors could feel, a presence that refused to be ignored. And just when investigators thought they understood it, the building would remind them otherwise. One night, a team entered the tunnel. Cameras rolling, lights on, radios crackling. Halfway down, they heard it, a soft, dragging shuffle, then a whisper calling a name, one of their own. They turned. Nothing. Yet the echo followed them for the rest of the night, climbing back up the hill, haunting their dreams even after they'd left. He opened the door to the east wing, and what he saw froze him in place. Before we continue to Section 8, tell me, if you were alone in that hallway, would you step forward, or run? Comment below. I want to hear your answer. By now, Waverly Hills had become more than just an abandoned sanatorium. It was a stage for stories, some whispered, some shouted across the internet, some etched in memory. But perhaps the most compelling evidence of the building's haunted reputation comes from those who've walked its halls, flashlight in hand, heart racing, fully aware that they are alone, or so they think. Take, for example, the account of a documentary crew who spent the night in the top floor ward. Around midnight, they set up cameras and began a standard sweep of room 502. As the crew adjusted the lights, one of the members felt a cold brush along her arm, as though someone had walked past her. When she turned, no one was there. The cameras recorded nothing unusual, yet the audio picked up a whisper, faint and almost indistinguishable. "Help me!" Or the story from a teenage visitor who dared to spend the night during a summer tour. Alone in the solarium, she reported seeing shadows moving across the floor, though the windows were closed and the night was still. When she raised her camera, the shadows didn't appear on tape, yet she swore the chill against her neck was real, the sense of eyes on her unmistakable. Even veteran paranormal investigators, people trained to rule out drafts, optical illusions, or mechanical noises, admit that Waverly Hills tests the limits of skepticism. One investigator described walking through the body chute tunnel with full lighting and radio communication. Midway, his handheld thermometer dropped 15 degrees in seconds. Then, faint footsteps echoed behind him, perfectly matching his own pace, even though no one else was in the tunnel. Some testimonies are quieter, almost sorrowful. A nurse who had worked tours recalled hearing soft crying in the women's ward, long after the last tour had departed. "It wasn't loud," she said. "It wasn't scary. It was just sad, like the building itself was mourning." Visitors often mention the same sensation, a heavy, melancholic presence that presses against the chest, as if the air remembers every loss that occurred within these walls. Then there are the more dramatic accounts. A tour guide once reported seeing a figure of a man in long, dark clothing pacing the hallway near the east wing. The guide, certain it was a trespasser, ran to confront him, only for the figure to vanish into a wall. Security cameras recorded no one, and other guides confirmed the hallway was empty at the time. Even children have noticed it. Guests recount small, unexplained giggles echoing in the solarium, doors gently closing when no one is around, and cold fingers brushing past them in rooms meant to be empty. The building, it seems, leaves no age untouched. Not all experiences are terrifying, some are deeply unsettling in their quietness. A couple who stayed overnight described waking in the middle of the night to a soft, rhythmic knocking. When they followed it to the end of a hallway, the sound stopped. No explanation, no person, no object could account for it. Only the lingering impression that something unseen had moved just ahead of them. These testimonies share a pattern. Shadows that vanish the moment they are observed, cold spots that appear and disappear, whispers with no source, and the feeling of presence, watching, waiting, remembering. Across decades, from nurses to tourists, from skeptics to believers, the evidence is consistent. Waverly Hills leaves its mark, even on the most skeptical mind. And yet, there is always the question, how much is history, and how much is legend? Some skeptics argue that the building's massive size, creaking floors, and temperature fluctuations account for much of the phenomena. Others suggest psychological suggestion plays a role, expectation amplifying ordinary occurrences into extraordinary experiences. But when multiple people report the same phenomena independently, footsteps echoing in sync, whispers in empty rooms, shadows that appear and vanish, skepticism starts to bend. Something, it seems, resides in Waverly Hills beyond ordinary explanation. And it is precisely this something that guides every visitor's experience, a presence born of memory, despair, and perhaps unrest. Each account threads together the history of human suffering with a contemporary sense of fear, producing a tapestry of stories that refuse to be silenced. One visitor, leaving after an overnight stay, described the final moment that stayed with him. Standing in the solarium at dawn, he saw sunlight hitting the floor, and for a fleeting instant, dozens of shadowy figures seemed to move toward him, then dissolve. He ran, but even outside the building, he said, he could feel the weight of their gaze. Waverly Hills doesn't just hold history, it amplifies it, projects it, makes it breathe again for anyone willing to walk its halls. And it does so with a patience only a century of sorrow can teach. And now, as you imagine standing in that solarium or walking the cold tunnel beneath the hill, the question lingers. If you could hear the whispers of the past, would you step forward to listen? Or would you leave before the building notices you? For every chilling tale whispered in the corridors of Waverly Hills, there is a record, a ledger, a document that attempts to ground the story in reality. And when you dig through the archives, the picture that emerges is complex, haunting, yes, but not always as extreme as legend insists. Take the infamous 63,000 deaths claim. Death certificates and hospital logs tell a different story. Researchers combing through Jefferson County records found that the peak year of tuberculosis mortality at Waverly Hills was around 150 patients. Over the nearly 50 years the sanatorium treated TB, the total number of deaths likely falls somewhere between 5,000 and 8,000, a tragic, yet dramatically lower figure than the ghost term mythos would have you believe. Still, fact alone cannot explain the building's reputation. The body chute, while practical, became the epicenter of fear. Even skeptics concede that the tunnel, descending into darkness beneath the hospital, has a peculiar atmosphere. Cold, damp, and echoing, it primes the imagination, and in a building where thousands have died, priming can feel like evidence. Paranormal investigators themselves sometimes acknowledge that human perception is easily influenced. Shadows stretch differently in low light, cold drafts can mimic the feeling of a ghostly touch, and creaking floors in an abandoned building sound unnervingly like footsteps behind you. Yet, even the most skeptical teams report phenomena they cannot fully explain, voices caught on recorders when the room is empty, temperature drops too sharp to account for air currents, and figures glimpsed on camera that vanish when approached. Historical newspapers provide insight, too. Articles from the 1920s and 30s report the sanatorium as a beacon of hope for tuberculosis patients, praising its architecture, fresh air therapies, and trained staff. Occasional obituaries describe patients passing quietly, without any mention of paranormal activity. Yet alongside these records, oral histories, nurses' journals, local folklore, and survivor accounts hint at something different, a feeling of presence, of energy lingering long after the patient had gone. Even skeptics acknowledge the psychological weight. In a place where death was routine, where grief was constant, and where the air carried the memory of suffering, it's unsurprising that visitors report seeing and feeling things that defy explanation. A building saturated with sorrow can affect the senses, amplifying perception, intensifying fear, and blurring the line between reality and legend. Yet here is the curious part. Despite decades of research, no single explanation has been universally accepted. Historians, psychologists, and paranormal investigators each hold pieces of the puzzle. Official logs provide death counts. Structural engineers confirm drafts and cold spots. psychologists point to suggestibility and fear. And paranormal teams swear they have captured something beyond these explanations. Waverly Hills sits at the intersection of history and myth. The archives tell the story of illness, loss, and human resilience. The legends tell the story of lingering presence, of shadows that move and whispers that call. Both are true, in their own ways. And for visitors, whether skeptical or believing, the experience of walking through its halls is the same: a palpable tension, a sense of watching eyes, a chill that isn't entirely from the cold. It is this delicate balance that keeps Waverly Hills eternally fascinating. Fact meets folklore, and the result is a building that continues to test the limits of imagination, reason, and fear. Every visitor leaves with questions. Every investigator leaves with evidence that can be explained, or that refuses explanation. And every story, whether historical or paranormal, layers upon the next, creating the legend we now know. The lingering proof of Waverly Hills is not just in the deaths recorded in ledgers. It is in the atmosphere, the shadows, the cold spots, and the whispers that persist through time. And when night falls and the corridors fall silent, it is impossible not to feel that the past has not yet left, that the memories of those who died, and perhaps something more, remain. And just when you think you understand it, the building reminds you: history is tangible, but legends are alive. Shadows shift where none should be, whispers echo from nowhere, and the weight of decades presses against your chest. Even decades after its closure, Waverly Hills continues to leave traces of its past, traces that defy simple explanation. Cameras capture shadows that disappear when approached, recorders pick up whispers that cannot be attributed to anyone in the room, and thermal imaging detects cold spots where physics says there should be none. These lingering pieces of evidence have made Waverly Hills a focal point for both skeptics and believers. Consider the body chute. Modern investigators have walked its length countless times, cameras and recording equipment in hand. Many report the same unsettling phenomena: footsteps echoing in perfect cadence with their own, faint moans rising from nowhere, and a chilling sensation of being followed. Yet the tunnel remains structurally sound, with no hidden passages to account for the noises. The paradox is simple: the evidence exists, yet no conventional explanation suffices. Room 502 remains equally compelling. Guests often experience extreme temperature drops, hear faint lullabies, and report feelings of overwhelming sadness. Paranormal teams have captured EVPs, voices saying phrases like, "Why did you leave me?" and motion sensors sometimes trigger without any movement present. The room has become a nexus, where personal tragedy, architectural design, and human memory collide to produce experiences that feel undeniably real. The solarium, too, offers chilling encounters. Daylight floods the room during the day, but at night, shadows shift unnaturally. Several overnight visitors report seeing fleeting silhouettes of patients sitting in the sunlight, or rather, in the ghostly echo of sunlight. One veteran investigator admitted to waking in the solarium to see dozens of faint figures standing silently, staring, only to vanish as he blinked. Photographic evidence, though debated, adds another layer. Blurry figures, orbs of light, and unexplained shapes appear repeatedly in images from different sources. While some argue these are reflections, dust particles, or camera artifacts, the consistency and placement of anomalies, especially in room 502 and the body chute, makes some experts pause. Patterns emerge that defy easy dismissal, leaving an uncomfortable question: are these merely coincidences, or something more? Even sound evidence pushes the boundary. Audio recordings from overnight tours often capture low moans, indistinct whispers, and sudden thuds. Some investigators claim to have recorded the same phrases independently on different devices in separate locations, hinting at a presence that cannot be explained by wiring, acoustics, or human interference. Visitors' personal accounts provide the human side of this evidence. They report the same feelings across decades: a sudden pressure on the chest, the sensation of being watched, objects moving subtly, an unshakable intuition that someone, or something, is near. These moments are fleeting yet unforgettable, leaving witnesses with an impression that cannot be captured in statistics or structural analysis. The collision of documented history and lingering evidence creates a compelling paradox. Waverly Hills was undeniably a site of suffering, death, and despair. Yet the modern phenomena, shadows, whispers, cold spots, suggest that human emotion and memory may have imprinted themselves onto the building in ways science struggles to explain. And it is here, in these collisions, that Waverly Hills fully earns its title as one of America's most haunted places. Not simply because of the past, but because the past continues to speak, quietly but insistently, to anyone who dares to enter. Some stories are chillingly personal. One overnight guest reported standing at the top of the body's chute, feeling the air pressed down with such intensity that it was as if countless hands were holding them back. Another described hearing the faint sound of a nurse singing a lullaby while walking the empty corridors, the melody carrying an impossible mixture of sorrow and reassurance. These aren't just anecdotes, they are experiences. Repeated across years, with eerie similarities by people who had never met. And so, as the stories pile up, one question hangs heavier than the rest. Before we conclude with the final section, consider this. If you were alone in room 502 or walking the body's chute, would you be brave enough to stay, or would you run for the exit, never looking back? Comment below. I want to see who would dare the sleepless night. Waverly Hills Sanatorium is more than just an abandoned hospital in Kentucky. It is a repository of sorrow, a building that has witnessed thousands of deaths, and a stage where history and legend intertwine in ways that are both chilling and mesmerizing. Walking its halls today, you feel the echoes of lives once lived, the weight of suffering, and the stories that refuse to fade. The sanatorium's legends, room 502, the solarium, the body's chute, and the countless whispers, aren't just entertainment. They are reminders of human fragility, of fear, and of the lingering presence of memory itself. Tourists, investigators, and skeptics alike find themselves caught in a delicate balance between disbelief and the undeniable experiences that keep drawing people back. Perhaps that is the true haunting of Waverly Hills, not spirits in the traditional sense, but the undeniable imprint of human tragedy, magnified by centuries of silence, neglect, and rumor. Even those who come seeking thrills cannot escape the weight of history pressing down upon them. Every cold draft, every unexplained shadow, every whisper in the dark seems to say the same thing: this place remembers. And yet, for all its terror, there is a strange beauty here, a melancholy so thick it feels almost tangible, a reminder that every life mattered, and every death left its mark. It is this interplay of history, sorrow, and the supernatural that keeps Waverly Hills alive, not in the present, but in memory and story. The sanatorium's halls, now open to the curious and brave, continue to tell their stories in whispers, shadows, and sudden chills. Visitors who spend even a single night often leave changed, carrying with them a sense that the building is not empty, that the past has a way of lingering longer than anyone expects. And so, as you close your eyes tonight, imagine stepping through its corridors, the cold concrete underfoot, the faint, lingering scent of antiseptic, the shadows flickering at the edge of vision. Imagine the echoes of voices long gone, of footsteps that no one else can hear, of eyes watching silently from the dark. Because Waverly Hills does not simply exist in the past. It exists wherever curiosity meets fear, wherever history meets legend, wherever the living meet the memory of the dead. And now, the final question hangs in the air, as it has for nearly a century in the hills of Kentucky. If you ever had to spend a night there, would you keep the lights off? Or would you run? That is the sleepless question. It is the one that lingers long after the story ends, the one that whispers in the corners of your mind when the house is quiet and the night is still. Waverly Hills waits. And it remembers.